The last unit we talked about the years 1300 to about 1600. Now we're going to talk about the years 1400 to 1800, and this time we're going to talk about exploration. So I just want you to keep in mind that as this stuff's going on that I'm going to tell you about in this unit, we also have the Renaissance and Reformation going on at the same time. There's lots of factors that contributed to European exploration and the discovery of new lands, and I'm going to give you a list of them that you need to know. The first one, and probably the one that was the one that encouraged them the most, was the demand for gold and spices and natural resources. The second one was support for the diffusion of Christianity, and people claimed that they wanted to go to new lands and teach the word of God to the savages and turn them into non-heathens. So it was a way to show mercy to those less intelligent, I guess you could say, in their eyes. And also political and economic competition between European powers was the third reason that exploration really took off. And suddenly it was this idea that the more land that you had and the more gold you had coming in from foreign lands, the richer, of course, you would be, and you would appear to your competition. Let's talk about innovations in navigational arts. The first thing we're going to talk about is the caravel. This is a European discovery, or invention, I should say, and it was really easy to build and very easy to navigate. It was very light. It didn't take a lot of men or wind power to get it to go where it needed to go, and the way that it was designed allowed for a lot of goods to be in the bottom of the boat, so easy to store supplies for a very long trip. The second thing we're going to talk about is the compass, and just like we talked about in the last unit, that of course came out of China, and the compass is used to navigate direction. The third thing that came about in this time period was something called an astrolabe, and an astrolabe was created by Islamic people, and it helps navigate by placing the sun and the moon and the planets and stars in relationship to each other, so that you could map out where you were by that relationship of all those astral bodies. The next thing that we're going to talk about is actually a human being, if you will click to the next slide. This man goes by the name of Prince Henry. He wasn't truly a prince, but he was always called Prince Henry. And Prince Henry had a great love for exploration and map making and just finding out things that other people didn't know. So he decided that he was going to map out the coast of Africa. The bad thing for Prince Henry was that he was afraid of the water. So he wasn't going to be on the boat himself, but he opened up a navigational school, and when he did that, he taught others how to sail. He knew how to sail, he just was afraid to. He taught others how to sail, and he sent them on trips, and he paid for it, and when they came back, based on what they told him, he drew maps of the coast of Africa, and the part that he did was the part that you see highlighted in the map here on this page. It's called the Ivory Coast, and so that part that is golden, looks golden in the map here, is the part that he mapped out. So the thing about Prince Henry and him doing the maps, once you know your way and you know what's coming, it makes people feel more safe and feel more comfortable in traveling to new lands. So he kind of set the standard for everybody, and other people followed in his footsteps. So Prince Henry the Navigator taught other people how to sail and used their words to draw the maps, which encouraged even more people to sail. So he was definitely a pioneer in the in new navigation, and he was from Portugal. The next man we're going to talk about was also from Portugal. The Portuguese people were the #1 sailing country in the world when all this exploration first began. And Vasco da Gama set out to find a way to get to India by water. They had been trading with India for a very long time, but it was a very, very long trip. Of course, the people from Europe went across the Mediterranean Sea, but you had to get out of the boat by the time you got to Israel, and from Israel to India is a very, very long trip across land. So Vasco da Gama felt that if he could figure out how to get there by water, they could bring a lot more goods in a lot less time. So in 1497, he found a direct sea route to India by sailing all the way around Africa. And if you'll click to the next page, you'll see the exact way that he routed out his trip. Now you can see right here how he did it, and it really is amazing that he actually made it. As he rounded the southern peak of Africa, the men said that they all felt that there was great hope now that they would make it all the way to India without perishing, and so that southern portion was nicknamed the Cape of Good Hope. The waters beyond the Cape of Good Hope are very, very, very rough, and the fact that he made it was, for that time period, was pretty much a miracle. But he mapped his way out. He made it clear to all those that were to follow him where the rough waters were and how to handle them and how to get to India safely. And it led to a lot of other people going to India and beyond. So every time somebody drew a new map a little farther in the world, it gave people the courage to keep going a little beyond their point, and before you know it, we have the whole world mapped out. So let's talk about heading west. That would be to us. The first guy we're going to talk about is Christopher Columbus, and I'm sure you know the old little poetry line in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He did, but he did not discover America. So let's talk about the story of Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was actually kind of a shyster. People didn't like him. They didn't trust him. He was a liar. He had gone to many different countries asking for money and support to go out and explore the world. And what he really wanted to do was to find an easier route to India. He thought that it was ridiculous to go all the way around Africa, and he wanted to find an easier way. So he had gone to Portugal, knowing that they were the leaders in exploration, and they turned him down. He had gone to France. He had gone to a lot of countries, Italy too, and they all turned him down. And finally he went to visit Queen Isabella, and at first Queen Isabella and her husband Ferdinand refused to see him. They had some other issues they were dealing with in their country, but she had heard from other people that Columbus had bright red hair. And he did. For Queen Isabella, that was kind of a sign from God. She too had bright red hair, almost the color of carrots, really. It was more orange than red. Her and Christopher Columbus both. Very few people had that color of hair back then, or now, to be honest. There's very few people that have that orangish red color to their hair. And she thought that it was a sign from God that she should hear what he had to say. So in 1490, I believe it was, he was brought before Queen Isabella, and she said she would give him the money to make a voyage. So, of course, he heads west to find an easier route to the Asian world, and he mistakenly lands in the Caribbean islands close to America. Not America, just the Caribbean islands. And if you keep clicking, I will show you his path and tell you the story of what happened when he got there. So you can see the 4 trips here. He took 4 altogether, and in the first trip, I'm going to tell you what happened in each of them, and maybe when you walk away, you won't be such a fan of Columbus Day, at least not to celebrate him. Maybe to get a day off work if you get it, but he really isn't the hero that he has been made out to be in children's books. All right, so his first voyage, he landed in the Caribbean islands, and he came in contact, of course, with Indians that were living in those islands, and he thought that they would make good and skilled servants. He said that they repeated whatever the white men said very quickly. Whatever they said to them, they repeated right back. He also told Queen Isabella that he thought that they would make really good Christians because they didn't seem to have a religion. So, you know, in the mindset of Europeans, hey, if you don't have a religion, why don't you just use ours? They thought it would be really easy to convert them. So he knew that Queen Isabella, Christianity was really important to Isabella, but in order to convince the whole royal court of Spain to let him do any more exploring, he knew that he had to bring them back some kind of wealth, a chance at wealth. So he thought that he would find lots of gold there. He didn't really. He found a little bit, and he found 6 Indians, and he draped them in all the gold that he could find in all the islands, and he brought them back to Spain with him and said, there is so much gold in that part of the world that this is how everyone dresses. So he convinced Isabella to let him come back again. So he was brought back a second time, and this time he figured that he had better bring back lots and lots of riches. So he enslaved the people that he found in the Dominican Republic at the time. That's where he landed the second time. And he enslaved them, and if they didn't do what he said, he murdered them. Hundreds of them were rounded up and shipped to Europe to be sold without the knowledge of the crown. Of course, a lot of them are going to die en route. And for the rest of the population, Columbus demanded that they bring him a certain amount of gold or silver within a certain time period, and if they didn't fulfill the quota that he set, he cut their hands off. And since there was, in fact, very little gold or silver to be had, the Spaniards basically just hunted them down and killed them all. But he brought back enough to satisfy the Queen and the King for a third trip. So in his return trip to Hispaniola this third time, he had been given orders by Queen Isabella that he was not allowed to enslave or mistreat any new Christians. Any of the people that they converted to Catholicism, any of the natives, that because they were fellow Christians and fellow Catholics, he was not allowed to be mean to them. She was very adamant that he not be mean to them. So when he got back to the islands in the Caribbean, he made it illegal to make any of them Christians. The missionaries that were there were allowed to preach to them and pastor them, but they were not allowed to actually baptize them and turn them into like official Christians. So he had some of his crew even hanged for disobeying him when he told them to not allow a baptismal of any of these slaves. They were trying to follow the orders of Queen Isabella and her husband Ferdinand, and so he had them hanged. He was, near the end of this last voyage, accused of mismanaging money of the settlers, and he was actually imprisoned when he went back to Spain. And it's hard to believe, but he was a liar and a conniver, and he was very good at talking people into his view of things. And when Isabella came to visit him and inquire as to where is all the riches that you promised me, he convinced her somehow to let him have a fourth trip. So in the fourth trip, Columbus and his men were caught up in a huge storm, and they were actually stranded in Jamaica for an entire year. The natives went to Hispaniola to get help because Columbus said he knew that he had magical powers over the moon. He had talked to some scientists when he was in Europe and found out when the next lunar eclipse was going to be, and he told the natives in the islands of the Caribbean that he could make the moon go dark. So when it actually happened, they got scared, and they did as he asked, and they went to the main island and asked for help. And the governor, who was in Hispaniola, actually absolutely hated Columbus and refused to help him. He said let him die on the island that he is stranded on. But the Indians were so terrified of Columbus because he had, predicted and maybe even caused this lunar eclipse, that the Indians put Columbus on their boat and took him back to the mainland of Hispaniola, because they didn't want him. They were afraid of him. So he was saved. Now, nothing was really accomplished as far as the crown getting anything good out of this. And basically what I just am trying to tell you is he did not discover America. He was not a nice man. He was a swindler that convinced a woman who really just wanted the views of Catholicism to be spread without hurting people. She was a very kind ruler, Queen Isabella, and she really did believe that Catholicism was the way to save a soul, and she thought that's what was going to happen. She truly wasn't that interested in what gold could be found in this part of the world. She just wanted to spread her views on religion because she thought it was the Christian thing to do. She really did. And Columbus took advantage of that. And pretty much he was tried and convicted of several minor crimes when he got back. He served a lot of time in jail, and then he just kind of faded. But the thing about Christopher Columbus, he did not discover America, but he did come all the way over here to a new part of the world that no one had been to before, at least not somebody who had written it down. We know that other people were here before him, but nobody had written it down and made such a big show of it. So the name of Christopher Columbus was very famous and very familiar all through Europe as that man who sailed to another part of the world. And it gave other people the courage to come to this part of the world too and do more exploring and find new lands, including America. So although he did not discover America, he is the reason that other people felt confident enough to come to this part of the world, and so America will be discovered. So you got to give him credit for that. But was he a hero? Absolutely not. I just wanted to give you an idea of, we're talking about exploration and people coming over here to this country. These are the tribes that we know existed when the first British people ended up coming here to American soil, making a home for themselves and running the Indians off their land. So these are the tribes we know of. There's no way to know the ones that perished without us knowing anything about them. So just keep that in mind. And when you go to the next page, it's going to show you how very quickly we took the land away from the Indians. I just feel like I can't talk about exploration in this part of the world without showing you what happened to the Indians. So click to the next slide and you'll see an animated map of how the Indians lost their land and how quickly it happened. So you can see as the green is going away, so are the Indians. And that's where they are today. So it is a really sad story that we could have done something so quickly. All right, so let's talk about a little bit more about exploration. Ferdinand Magellan took sail in 1519, and he sailed around the southern end of South America and became the very first traveler to sail directly from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And he was the first to cross the entire Pacific. So he reached the Philippines and he claimed the land for Spain. But in the Philippines, something happened that we're not really completely sure about. There were 237 men that started out on the ship with Ferdinand Magellan, and by the time that they returned home to Spain, he's a Spanish sailor, by the time that they returned home to Spain, there were 18 men left. And the stories that these crew members told were not really very clear. We know that they made it to the Philippines, and we know for sure that Magellan died there, but we don't really know what he died of. Some of the sailors said that he died of smallpox. Some of them said that they were actually captured by an Indian tribe in the Philippines, and Ferdinand Magellan was speared in the foot and couldn't get away, and then one of the Indians speared him in the foot so that he couldn't move, and then all the other members of the tribe jumped on top of him and killed him. Some of the crew members said that a lot of the crew members who had already passed away, of course, were guilty of taking over the ship and killing Magellan themselves. So we really don't know what happened to him. All we know is that he died in the Philippines. So he set sail in 1519, and by 1522, what was left of his crew, 18 men, showed back up in Spain and officially became the first crew to circumnavigate the world, which means to completely go around it. So they know that word, circumnavigate. It was the first time that a crew had ever done that, but they lost their leader along the way. Here is the path of Magellan. So, not many more paths that you could take, and you can see where Magellan died. So he made it about halfway around the world with his crew. All right, Hernando Cortez was also from Spain, and he was asked by Charles V to come and investigate rumors of a very rich Indian tribe in what we now call Mexico. So in 1519, he and 600 men came over to Mexican territory, what is now Mexican territory, and actually they were seeking the people living in modern-day Mexico City. Back then, the people living in that location were the Aztecs, and he claimed the land for Spain. He actually took down 5 million Aztecs. So a pretty scary thought that somebody could actually do that. But Cortez had heard rumors of very powerful people, the Aztecs, of course, who lived there. But he also heard rumors of a story that they believed about a great god that was supposed to come and visit the Aztecs and take them over and make them the greatest empire on the entire planet. So they had heard this myth before, and you can see he landed in the Gulf of Mexico, but that's still a really long way to get all the way to Mexico City. So he and his 600 men traveled a very long way across land to get to the Aztec kingdom or empire. And along the way, they kind of picked up pieces of that story, and it was corroborated. So they realized that the Aztecs really did believe that a whitish man, I should say, because he's Spanish, was supposed to come and take them over and lead them to the greatest empire ever. But he also realized that all the people outside of the Aztec empire hated the Aztecs, absolutely hated them. If you remember from World War I, these are the people that captured innocent people and ripped their hearts out and served it up to their gods, to appease their gods. And they would do thousands of people in one day sometimes. So they're not well liked at all. And by the time that Cortez actually got to the Aztecs, he had lots and lots of extra help to take down the Aztecs. And when he got to the Aztec kingdom, he just told them the lie that he was the white god coming to take them over, and the king allowed him in, and a great battle ensued. And a lot of the fighting was very up close, of course, because they didn't have very good weapons, and a lot of the Indians got disease very, very quickly as blood was exchanged between the Spanish and the Indians. They died very quickly from disease, and other than that, they just basically wiped them out. So the Aztecs were completely destroyed for a little bit of gold, and it was done by Charles V of Spain. But the story of Charles V does not end with just Cortez. He also sent another man, Francisco Pizarro, to research a group that he had heard was living in Peru. So he landed in Peru and conquered the Incas in 1532. And again, he did it for Spain in 1532. And basically they went in, and his men went in, and they kidnapped the emperor and held him for hostage. And in exchange, they wanted a room full of gold. They gave him the room full of gold, and they killed him anyway. And without a leader, the Incan Empire just kind of disappeared, and that was the end of the Incans. So Spain destroyed two great empires in this part of the world, the Incans and the Aztecs. On a lighter note, let's talk about Jacques Cartier. Jacques was, of course, French. I'm sure you can tell that by his name. And in 1534, he was asked to sail over to this part of the world by his home country, France, and he ended up going towards Canada, and he discovered the St. Lawrence River. And he put his little flag down and said, this river belongs to France, and we think he actually is the guy who named it St. Lawrence. He wrote it down in his memoirs. We don't know if he got it from Indians there or if it was his name, but it is still called the St. Lawrence River, and he is the very first one to ever actually document it. So much better than what happened to the Aztecs and the Incans, right? But we haven't talked about England yet. Let's talk about England. Remember when we talked about Elizabeth and the Spanish Armada? Well, Elizabeth had a favorite captain who had fought against the Spanish Armada, of course, and won, and his name was Francis Drake. So when it was decided that England needed to get in on this exploration stuff because people were coming back with rumors of gold and riches and, lots of people to Christianize, they decided that they better get in on it, and they sent Francis Drake to circumnavigate the world, just like Magellan had done. Only this time they were hoping that Francis Drake would actually survive along with his crew, and in 1580 he became the very first captain to circumnavigate the world, and he did it in the name of England. So, of course, he was a great hero. All right, so let's look at how the Age of Exploration changes the world. First of all, in general, colonists of Catholic and Protestant faith settled in the new territories and brought their faith with them. And wherever they settled, they tried to convert the indigenous people there and completely altered some of their religious beliefs. So that was a very big deal. Let's look at how exploration changed Africa. European trading posts were set up all along the coast of Africa. And again, like I said earlier, it's called the Ivory Coast. And there on the Ivory Coast, the trade was slaves, ivory, and gold as exports, things going out of Africa. And then in exchange, they were getting corn, peanuts, and rum as imports, things coming into Africa. So the African slave trade, most of the slaves that came to this part of the world came out of that Ivory Coast. So let's talk about how it changed the Americas as well. There's big changes in America because you have not only the massive migration into these new lands over here, but you also have a massive migration out of Europe. So it changes both places. You've got these new people taking over territory from the natives here, but suddenly over in Europe you have lots of jobs and land, lots of new opportunities for the people left behind. So it changed the dynamics of both places. Of course, it also led to the demise of both the Incans and the Aztecs. We talked about that. And there begins a legacy of dictatorial rule in Latin America by the Spanish. And we're going to talk about that a lot in later units down the road. But just remember that it is the Spanish predominantly that goes into Latin America and does basically what the English do in America. Then, of course, another change that you have is that forced migration of Africans into slavery, and they're going to be a new population here in the Americas as well. And you have that culture and social pattern of the parent countries that are brought to the Americas, and they completely change the face of the societies for the indigenous people already living here, and that's on all levels. The way they dress, their language, their religion, the homes that they live in, all of that is supposed to change, and the Europeans really believe that it should mirror their worlds rather than the indigenous population's world. All right, the Columbian Exchange is going to change the face of Europe and America, and the Columbian Exchange is simply an exchange of goods or ideas or even disease between the two continents. So if you look at the chart here, items from the Indians, of course you can see they're the ones that gave us corn, potatoes, and tobacco, and in exchange we gave them coffee, dandelions, and wine. Of course, let's get the Indians drunk. We're the ones that introduced that to them. As far as animals, you can see the exchange of beavers, horses, and cattle. A lot of people don't realize that it was actually the Spanish that brought the horses, very first horses, over to this part of the world and gave them to the Iroquois Indians, and that's how they got their reputation as great warriors. They were the first to really raise horses to use in battle. And then you can see is the odd exchanges that you can't really categorize, like the canoe, the horseshoe, the hammock. Those are all things that the Indians gave us, and in exchange we basically gave them death. Smallpox, measles, Black Death, and again, sometimes we killed them on purpose. We gave them blankets that were from the dead bodies of people who had died from smallpox. They were very, very easily killed off by any kind of disease because they had never experienced any of it. All right, plus you have all this stuff. Shortage of labor for new cash crops is going to lead to slavery. And eventually here in America, not in most other places, America's the big one for this, slavery is going to become based on race. So in Africa, it's never based on race, of course, and it really isn't in a lot of other places. That's kind of an American thing. And then you have the European plantation system is going to do huge, huge damage to the people themselves, to the economy. It's going to do bad things to the environment, to the soil. It's just basically going to turn their world upside down as far as the indigenous people's world goes. As you see here, the Columbian Exchange is going to lead to something called the triangular trade. And basically the triangular trade took place between Africa, the continent of Africa, the Americas, and mostly England. So there's your triangle. At those three spots, the ship would stop and drop off one good and pick up another. In Africa, they dropped off rum and they exchanged that for slaves. The slaves were brought over to the Americas where they were exchanged for sugar. The sugar was taken to England where it was exchanged for the rum that would go into Africa, and it just kept going round and round and round. So there's other items as well, but the three main items and the ones I would like you to know that were used in this triangular trade between these three peoples was the sugar, the rum, and the slaves. The slaves were brought over on what is known now as the Middle Passage, and this is the first time that you have a massive migration of peoples out of one country and into another, a forced migration anyway, and that is the triangular trade. Now, how do you keep all these people in control if there's 200 African Americans who are terrified and scared and angry all at one time, and you have a crew of 10 white people that are supposed to keep them in control? So there's not a lot of opportunity for mistakes here because they would have killed the white people. They knew that bad things were ahead for them. They had been kidnapped. They were they were being kept below board, in the darkness most of the time, chained to each other, chained to the bows of the boat. And when they were brought up to the sunlight, they were chained again. So these are some of the tools of the trade that the whites used to keep them in control. At the top you see handcuffs with no give whatsoever, and they usually handcuff them palms up. So it would be really hard to smack somebody or fight somebody because with palms up, it's a much weaker hit than with your palms down. You can't use as much force. They also, as a form of torture, or even just a way to keep you still, they would use the thumb screw, but it was also used as a big toe screw. So the thumb screw was basically just to hurt you and do mean things to you. But the toe, if they used it for the toes, it kind of kept you in place. You can't walk when your big toes are together, and they would put them through the loops that you see there and then screw the flat bar very tightly so you couldn't move your thumbs or your toes. At the bottom you see the foot shackles. Now the foot shackles, you see there's no give in it whatsoever, so you can't run. But they also used it to make sure that nobody jumped overboard, and the way that they did that was by using a very, very long back bar, and they would join 4 to 6 people together, and they figured that it would cut down on the suicide rate and the number of people trying to jump overboard to complete that suicide wish, because it's harder to convince 5 other people than just yourself to commit suicide. So they wanted to make sure that their cargo landed in the new lands intact and that they lost as few people as possible, because those people meant money to them. So the African Americans decided that there were other ways to kill themselves other than jumping overboard, and one of them was to starve themselves to death. So if you look in the middle there of the pictures, you'll see something called a speculum oris. And if you refused to eat, then the prongs of the speculum were put together to form a steeple, and they held you down and crammed it between your front teeth, usually, of course, breaking your teeth. And then they would use the screw to pry your jaws apart and force feed you. So nobody was going to die of starvation on one of those boats. And you can see here other ways that they would use that back bar or the handcuffs depending on what they needed them for. You can see a picture here also of what it probably looked like in the bows of the boat as the men were chained to each other and the boat so that they couldn't get out. Very few examples of insurrections in history. There's only one massive insurrection where the slaves actually took over the boat. So that should tell you how well they kept them chained down and in control. Now, if they smarted off or you were a white person in charge of them and you felt like they were getting too big for their britches and maybe they might be thinking about doing something, you could use this whip. It was called a cat nine tails, and the reason it's called that is because it has 9 prongs on it. And the 9 prongs were made of very, very thin, strong leather, and every time it hit you, it actually cut you 9 times. So the cuts were mostly like severe paper cuts where they hurt really, really, really bad, but it didn't damage the property, being the human being that they were hitting. And they would use it on your back, maybe on your stomach, across your buttocks. So it wouldn't even keep you from working when you got to your new home. It was just very painful. It was very painful. So it wouldn't damage you forever, and that's why they used it. With all the new expiration, eventually there's going to be new laws about how to control trade. And one of the laws that was pretty prominent in the early period was one called mercantilism. Sometimes it's called a theory, because basically what mercantilism means is a set of rules designed with the basic idea that colonies exist only to benefit the mother country, or the country who had taken them over. So none of these mother countries cared what happened to the colonies. They figured if they destroyed them, then they could just get others. So they took everything they could from them and basically bled them dry. Many of them got raw goods from the colonies. Those raw goods were transported by force to the mother country, and the mother country would turn them into goods. Like if they got wood from our American colonies, the mother country, being England, would turn it into chairs, and they would turn around and sell those chairs back to the colonies at a very high price. And part of the laws of mercantilism said that the American colonies could only buy from England and nobody else. So if those chairs cost $1 million and you needed a chair, you still had to buy it from England and no one else. And that's kind of the laws of mercantilism. But overall, I just want you to know that it was all about what can they do for the mother country, irregardless of how it hurt the colonies themselves. And you can also see on this slide that it led to new markets, new money and banking systems. So it helped the economy completely across the board for the rich countries that were doing the exploration, and it was stifling the poor colonies who suddenly weren't allowed to trade with anybody that they wanted to. So mercantilism was actually a bad thing. So that's the end of the exploration unit. And you can see, along with Renaissance and Reformation, all these massive changes going on all over the planet. And next time we're going to talk about even more things happening, more changes going on all at the same time. So I will see you then with my grandfather clock in the background. Talk to you soon.